Boa tarde a todos. Declaro aberta a 7ª
Good
reunião
afternoon to all. I declare open the session of the Senate to discuss the law of artificial intelligence. We are going to start the third panel, which is a core subject for our reflection, transparency, bias, and due process in automated decision-making, which is the key thing for both that makes the laws and the ones that are affected by the laws, and through its workings can contest it. And transparency is also an important vehicle to fight any problems with artificial intelligence in terms of bringing elements to protect individual privacy, to mitigate bias, and to protect users and everyone affected in their human rights. So this is called the due process of algorithm process. So we have the honor to count with illustrious speakers and debaters for this panel. As a debater, that is Valiana Valente and Miguel Arantes, which are members of the Senate. We're going to hear Rojane Bellamy from the Center for the Formation Policy and Leadership, Avita Sanguri, Digital Impacted in Alliance, Aupan Chandler from Georgetown University, all are from the Other Lovely Universe Institute, and Mark Houtenberg, which is the chief of the Digital Intelligence Center. So without further ado, since we have a brief moment, I will pass on the floor to Mariana Valente to introduce the first speaker. Thank you so much, Juliano Maranhão, for the introduction. I would like to thank you all and to start right away this panel. That is one of the big pillars of these discussions, which is transparency, the process. I will pass the floor without further ado to Opa Belani. He's the professor of law and technology at Jordan. Bojana worked as the prior to joining CPL, Bojana served as 12 years as the Global Director of Data Privacy at Accenture and worked for 8 years as Principal Consultant with Privacy Laws and Business Consulting and Auditing Projects for private and public sector clients in the UK and abroad. She sits on a number of advisory industry boards, including the Internet Commission Advisory Board, OECD's Privacy Guideline Expert Group, and Thomson Reuters Practical Law. I thank you so much, Bojana, for bringing, to add your knowledge to the seminary. Thank you so much. The floor
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariana. And forgive me, the translator is taking some time, so I had to wait. But I'm delighted to be with you here virtually, and I hope we get a chance to continue this important conversation live as well. I always enjoy visiting Brazil and have had a big pleasure of working with many policy lawmakers, experts, and friends now in Brazil. And I always admire very open discussions and very multi-stakeholder approach to these topics. And today's topics on how we regulate AI, what are the best practices, is hugely important. I've just looked at McKinsey's report on top technology trends for the years ahead, where they say to us that in the next decade, we are going to experience more progress than in the past 100 years. And you will not be surprised to know that one of the top 7 technology trends that McKinsey talks about is applied AI, computer vision, neural language processing, speech technology. It is incredibly important that we enable development and adoption of applied AI and these technologies, but in a way that respects fundamental rights, respects privacy and other interests. So we've got this dual goal. How do we ensure benefits of the AI? And McKinsey tells us those companies who adopt AI technologies are going to be more competitive. They will be ahead than the others. So this is the big question. We at CIPL have been doing quite a lot of work in the past few years on looking as to what does smart regulation of AI technology look like. And I would like to share with you some of the learnings we have had, but also during our work, especially in the EU, where we have seen the proposed EU AI regulation. We've had the GDPR as well. And so I'd like to share some of the lessons learned. And maybe the first thing to say is that it's important that to understand that AI technologies bring some inherent tensions in the way they operate with the way that data protection rules work. And it is important that any country and any regulator, legislator understands these inherent tensions. What do I mean by this? In our paper, we have identified a number of these tensions. And the first one is, for example, the tension between the requirement of data minimization and the fact that AI needs vast and large quantities of data to ensure accuracy and to ensure fairness and non-bias. So how do we square these different requirements? We need to make some trade-offs, and it's important to understand that these trade-offs exist. In order to be fair and non-biased, our algorithmic modeling needs to use sensitive data. And we can't use sensitive data unless we have consent. Well, that doesn't work, right? So our laws have to be aligned, understanding these tensions and be able to solve them either through the lawmaking or through the interpretation of the law. And I'm very pleased to say that, in fact, some of the work already in the EU, the UK government, Dubai, but even in Brazil, we have got the principle of non-discrimination. And in order to comply with the LGPD principle of non-discrimination, we will have to use sensitive data and perhaps retain data longer to make sure that modeling is accurate, non-biased, and fair. So you could kind of interpret this compliance with the legal obligation. So this is really the first point. The second point I'd like to say is that it's important that we do not duplicate rules. In Europe, we have got GDPR. In Brazil, we have LGPD. And LGPD regulates already use of data in automated decision-making and for AI. And that's really important to know, right? The whole of LGPD is technology neutral. So all of these rules will already apply. All of the privacy principles, individual rights, data transfers, accountability, data protection officer, and specifically, of course, Article 20 talks about automated decision-making rules and gives individuals a special right to request review of decision that is made solely by automated processing. And companies need to provide criteria and explanation of how that decision has been made. And this is similar to the GDPR automated decision processing requirement. And in some ways, it's actually, in my opinion, more advanced and better articulated, because the gist of this is enabling individuals to contest the decision, to understand why that decision has been made, and potentially to request human intervention and human oversight. And to me, that is really what human-centric AI is all about. So what I think is important is that as we create these new rules on AI, we do not duplicate what we have in LGPD, but we build on that. And importantly, we also build on the best practices that companies are starting to develop as a result of LGPD. For example, we have seen that many companies who have been developing data protection impact assessment are using these same methodology and tools to conduct AI impact assessment. So we shouldn't be asking now another requirement for AI impact assessment, but just making sure that there is this outcome of assessing the risks and benefits of AI. So building on what we have already, building on best practices, and certainly lots of tools and best practices for LGPD can be used also to deliver responsible AI. I'd like to share just a few more comments on what I think is also an optimum approach of how we think about AI. It is important that we do not regulate technology, but the impact of technology, right? So I would suggest a light legal regime that is future-proof and that can evolve as this technology and as best practices change as well. This is incredibly important. And ultimately, we have to think, what is it that we are trying to achieve here? We are trying to ensure rights and benefits are delivered through AI. So we have to have these human-centric rules. And so every time we want to regulate, we should ask ourselves, how does this help individuals? How does this help society versus does this create just burdens? Because it's really important that we do not burden this new incumbent companies and businesses who are going to be wanting to use AI, who will have to compete using AI, right? Data, cloud, and AI, these are the three absolute necessary ingredients of success of every company. And this is really important to understand. Second point, we need a risk-based approach to regulating AI. This means three things. One, the rules must be risk-based, right? We cannot regulate every type of AI in the same way. There are those AI decisions that make significant impact, legal effect on people, and that's what we want to take into account. Not every single machine learning decision that by default, if we are to trust what McKinsey has said, every company will be doing in large quantities as well. So important to consider the risk-based approach to the rules, but also the reticence risk. What are we losing if we do not deploy AI? What are the benefits of AI? So it's really a balanced approach. The second part of risk-based approach is actually how do we make sure that the rules are also implemented based on risk? So companies need to prioritize and implement the rules based on risk. And thirdly, regulators and supervision must be also risk-based. So this is very important. Whoever is going to be enforcing rules of AI, it will be IMPD, maybe another regulator, sectoral. They must enforce rules in a risk-based approach. And so this really brings me to what I call onion, layered approach to AI. One, we have in the center this light touch, principle-based, outcomes-based rules that will not be overtaken by the fast pace of AI technology. Around it, this is very important, we have got organizational accountability, co-regulation, and standards which augment these rules. And then thirdly, we have got smart regulatory oversight. This is the only way by which we will ensure that we have got smart and technology neutral also AI regulation. It is incredibly important that we incentivize accountable and best practices for AI. We have seen a lot of best practices develop in the marketplace. They're often driven by engineers, data scientists, AI scientists. And in fact, we have been asking for explicit accountability outcome-based obligation in the AI regulation, which would incentivize organizations to put in place measures to deliver responsible AI. How they do that, it's up to them. What particular best practices they do, again, it depends because they're changing all the time. They'll be augmented by industry standards, but the outcomes of transparency, of fairness, on non-discrimination, for example, these outcomes must be there. But there must be outcomes as well in terms of governance, who oversees in my organization AI? How do I provide training and awareness to engineers who are building AI products and services? Do I have an AI ethics committee internally or perhaps externally who delivers additional oversight? What are the privacy and other technological measures that I can put in place to ensure responsible AI? So that's what I mean by accountability. Just like accountable privacy program, we need to ensure organizations and public sector, I'm talking about both because both will be using AI, they deliver these responsible AI practices and they're able to demonstrate that through certification, codes of conduct, etc. And then finally, I talked about smart regulator. It is really going to be important to ensure proper oversight from regulatory perspective. This regulator should be risk-based. Of course, using innovative tools, I'm very much in favor, and you know that CIPL has been calling for regulatory sandbox. AI sandbox is something that could be very useful. We have seen this adopted in the UK, in Norway, in France. I know that Brazil has pioneered financial sandbox. Well, just like that, we can actually extend and use sandboxes to enable what I call responsible experimentation and responsible innovation with a feedback loop from regulator. And there are some other innovative tools as well, like policy prototyping and generally responsible experimentation. It's very important that the regulator enables this, specifically around AI, because as I have said, the technology and the best practices keep changing so much that it's very hard to capture them in the rules, in the laws. It's very gray, lots of gray areas, and the only way we can discuss these trade-offs, we can best apply AI is indeed by using sandbox. I just want to tell you that in the UK, the Information Commissioner has just completed a regulatory sandbox in respect of facial recognition technology. And as a result of this sandbox, first of all, we have a better product on the market, but secondly, it helped regulator formulate better understanding, and they have actually changed the policy and the guidelines that apply to everybody else. So that's really the way we want this regulatory system to work, not the old-fashioned rules, enforcement, command and control, but collaborative, constructive engagement. My final point. What is going to be very important is to ensure that any regulator, and I think AMPD is going to have a big role to play simply because lots of AI will be using personal data and it will be covered by LGPD. But AMPD will be also must cooperate with competition regulator, with consumer regulator, with financial regulator, sectoral regulators who will be maybe in energy space or health and safety. And that collaboration is going to be very critical in order to ensure proper oversight over AI. I do not believe we need another AI-specific regulator, but in fact, instead, we need to enable the data protection AMPD to become a wider regulator and to collaborate with other digital regulators through regulatory hubs. And again, an example from UK, Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum is a good example to look at as to what this may look like. I will stop my conversation and my remarks here. Again, thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel and taking part in the discussion.
Muito obrigada, Bojana. Rapidamente.
Thank you very much, Bojana. We've quickly spoke on the centrality of human being, on the regulation of AI and the importance of the regulation on the effects and not the technology per se, and also on the importance of regulations based on risk-based regulations and risk assessments, since they have different requirements. We also spoke about tensions between other legislations with regard to the GDPR, and also with the reduction of data use, which is a requirement on data production, which eventually in machine learning must be reviewed. And Professor Bujana has also mentioned on the best practices, the accountability, the creation of regulatory sandboxes in order to help improving the very regulation itself. And finally, on the relationship between other regulation organizations and the eventual regulation of AIs. I would like to thank you, Professor Abujana. And I would like to introduce our next guest, Professor Anupan Chander from Georgetown University. Professor Chander is the professor of technology law, graduated by Harvard College and Yale Law. He's the author of Electronic Circumvote, published by Yale University Press. He worked as a lawyer in New York, Hong Kong, and he's assistant professor in Cornell Chimba in China. He's also the winner of awards such as Google Research Awards, Andrew Mellon Grant, who was the consultant of the World Bank, and he's a non-resident member of Yale's Information Society Project and the Center of Democracy and Technology. And he's also a member of American Law Institute. Welcome, Professor Chander, once more with us. It's a pleasure seeing you again.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. I love Brasilia. It's such a gorgeous city, and I'm sorry that we're not able to be there. And I really appreciate it. Let me just begin by saying, complimenting my co-panelist, Bojana Bellamy, for brilliant remarks. And I wanted just to, just concur with everything that she said, and I think we could rest, I could rest happy. Okay, so let me begin by talking a little bit about issues of transparency and bias and due process from a more kind of theoretical perspective, which is probably why you've brought me here. But with some practical consequences as well. So let me share my screen. Okay, so first thing to note is that this page is produced by an AI. So it's the Microsoft AI, which is pretty darn good. And so, I believe in AI. I use it on a daily basis. I use it in my teaching, literally to make my thoughts more clear. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about these issues, but I want to frame them in a kind of broader landscape. The grand narrative of the new century may well be the continual expansional advantage of the few in one domain into another domain, as ever new frontiers are conquered. The meek and poor may never inherit the earth. And I think this is something that we have to be very thoughtful about when we think about new technologies. Are the new technologies, whom are they advantaging and whom are they disadvantaging? And this has been a theme in much of my work. And the particular paper I'm going to draw upon this afternoon is a paper in the Michigan Law Review called The Racist Algorithm. Okay. Let me also begin by congratulating the Brazilian senators for seeking to foster responsible AI. I think you understand this problem that I am describing, it's reflected in the way the bill is structured. But I want to just kind of pull the aperture wider. So my main point is that with respect to transparency, looking inside an AI algorithm may not actually tell you very much. And it can be, in fact, misleading. So I want to focus my initial remarks on that problem. Sorry, I'm just going to reset this clock here. Okay, so even a transparent, facially neutral algorithm can still produce discriminatory results. The same algorithm can in fact produce wildly different results depending on the data it's trained on. So the black box metaphor can be misleading. The problem isn't that the algorithm is a black box and we need to look inside how it works. The problem is that we need to look and see what is the black box doing? What are its results? What are its inputs and what are its outputs? I think that's the more critical feature of the algorithm. That is, if we know the results of an algorithm are systematically discriminatory, then we know enough to seek the redesign of the algorithm or to throw the algorithm out. The distinction that I'm trying to draw is similar to the one in US law between demonstrating disparate treatment and disparate impact. That is, we don't need to show intent that we were mistreating people, but that was the impact. And so that's the critical question here. When we are using algorithms to replace human decision makers, are we doing so in a way that has a negative effect on people? Regardless of whether or not the algorithm itself, if you opened it up, looks entirely neutral. Okay. And so I'll argue that we need to be able to audit the models, to test them. And this requires the ability for outside researchers to be able to access the algorithm. It may require the ability of government regulators to challenge the algorithm and to be able to understand it and to be able to see how it's working on large populations. One of my concerns, I should say, in general in this area is that there is a large market pressure among AI companies to puff up their algorithm as doing more, promising better than it actually delivers. In the United States, I think we have not done a good job, for example, of regulating the AI used by automated vehicles. And so you see today the highway authorities saying we're expanding our probe into Tesla's vision AI and driving AI. And I think that has had, unfortunately, our regulators have been late to the game, trusting Tesla too much when it said, oh, our AI is safer than human beings. So I think we need to be careful about this, and we need regulators to be able to challenge this. So the importance of getting this right is clear as well. So we're seeing this AI being used on our streets. IBM has an algorithm that it says will distinguish refugees from terrorists, and which seems, frankly, unbelievable to me. And retailers can target shoppers for discounts, et cetera, et cetera. The uses of AI in our everyday environment are very significant. And they have meaningful impact on our lives. So, but we need to rely upon automated algorithms. So I'm not an anti-AI person. As I said, I began by noting that I used AI to help me with this very presentation. For example, search, the news feeds we receive for authenticating ourselves. When I turn this computer on, I use an AI to identify myself to the computer. Those things can be very, very helpful. But my general point is that we need to design our algorithms for a world permeated with the legacy of discriminations past and the reality of discriminations present. That discrimination will be encoded in the training data and other real-world data that the AI acts on. So, and if we know, once we know that the real-world facts upon which the AI is trained and operates is deeply suffused with discrimination, then our prescription to the problem has to be quite sophisticated. This problem has to be quite sophisticated. So it's not simply transparency. It's going to have to be far, far more involved and difficult. Transparency is the easy part of this. The harder part is making these algorithms produce fair results. And furthermore, the algorithm itself could potentially be perceived as being more neutral than human decision makers. So that is one of the concerns in this context, that it's easy to say that the computer doesn't care if I'm black or white. The computer doesn't care what my gender is. The computer doesn't have any preferences at all. So it becomes easier to say that an algorithm, the computer, is objective, and it is clearly better on these measures than the human decision maker, who we all know. We could take implicit association tests, for example, implicit bias tests that show that we are not, that all of us have various biases. Indeed, engineers often convince themselves that their AI is going to be objective, non-discriminatory, because they didn't write discrimination into the code. They didn't encode it in that way. But of course, any sophisticated engineer will know that the algorithm will learn from the data upon which it's trained. And so it takes a lot of foresight to be careful about the data that it's trained on. Okay. Now, Bojana Bellamy raised another critical point, which is this issue of sensitive data that may be forbidden to be used by the data protection law, which is necessary to be used to actually solve the problems that I'm talking about. Okay, that is, in order to be able to demonstrate and to be confident that your algorithm is not discriminating, you actually need the data about gender or race or whatever other criterion that you may be worried about to confirm that it is not discriminating. So this is the kind of counterintuitive to I think many of us, which is, in order for the algorithm, the AI, to not be biased, it's important somewhere in the process for us to learn all that information about you, that sensitive data about you, so that we can test and make sure that our results are not biased. Okay. Now, of course, as I've said, bias is very much a feature of human decision-making as well. So it's always going to be a difficult standard to try to remove all bias. So I think this is a difficult challenge. And one of the tasks of this panel is to talk a little bit about due process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. Due process is, of course, necessary, in particular for important governmental decisions, approving or denying welfare benefits, determining your risk of criminal activity, determining your eligibility for parole from prison, et cetera, determining your fitness to serve as an adoptive parent. All these kinds of decisions are now being um, now often involve AI systems. We should be very cautious when those AI systems cannot be examined fully. That is, tested fully. They're with large populations of data, so that we can be comfortable that they are not producing results that are unfair. Now, here I want to point out that this, I have referenced unfairness a number of times, and this is a very difficult challenge. In our own world, in pre-artificial intelligence, we haven't defined what fairness means. Brazil has introduced over the last 2 decades affirmative action in higher education, for example, trying to ensure some level of fairness in educational opportunities, and do so in a very affirmative way. The problem in this context is that the metrics for unfairness or fairness are actually very difficult to establish. The context in which the issues arise are bewilderingly large. Okay. Now, in terms of affirmative action, I think it's important for companies themselves to be engaged in affirmative action to make sure that their algorithms are not so biased with respect to gender, race, and other criteria. So this is going to be a difficult challenge for companies, but I think it has to be the first order priority for companies as they move forward. Now, a couple final points on the bill. One, the bill currently encourages the government agencies to embrace artificial intelligence systems. I'm not confident that our AI systems are quite ready in all these places. So I would encourage thoughtful, measured, well-tested embrace of these systems. So I might add a few more cautions in that language to embrace such for government agencies. And I also think it's critical to be able to audit systems. So we need to be able to have transparency of inputs and outputs so that researchers can get access to these systems to test them out. They don't necessarily need to know exactly how the systems work, but they should be able to test them against their own data and to see how the systems respond. Thank you all so much. I'm delighted to participate in this, and I'm eager to hear my other co-panelists, and am available for further conversation on these matters. Thank you.
Nós que queremos agradecer sua
We would
fala.
like to thank you for your speech, Professor Chander. Particularly, thank you very much for the interesting speech you gave us on transparency and its importance, but it doesn't suffice to produce fairness in the outcomes, and the way you position yourself regarding the objectivity and your relation with machine learning, but particularly your stance on the need for approaching discrimination as something with regard to affirmative action. That's a very interesting topic. Thank you very much for your specific contributions on the bill. Now, I would like to invite Carly Keynes. She's the head of Ada Lovelace Institute. It's an institute of independent research and deliberative body with a remit to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. She is a human rights lawyer working in the intersection of technology. She has advised the industry, the government, and non-profit organizations on digital rights, privacy and data protection, and corporate accountability in the technology sphere. She has worked with the European Commission, the Council of Europe, numerous UN bodies, and a range of civil society organizations. She was formerly legal director of Privacy International, an NGO dedicated to promoting data rights and governance. Carly, now you have the floor, and I would like to thank you for your contribution.
Thank you so much, Mariana. And thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you. And congratulations on being at the forefront of this new field of regulation, despite its real challenges. I'm going to give a few brief remarks. I will use a PowerPoint presentation if that's okay. So give me 1 second to just share my screen with you. And I hope that you can see that. Mariana, can you give me a hands up? Yeah, all good, great. Wonderful. So as Mariana said, I am a human rights lawyer and I am the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. We're based in London, but we're an institute with a relatively global remit to look at issues of data and AI and ensure that they work for people and society. And we're not an academic research institute. We are a policy-facing body. So we use synthesis, case studies, expert working groups, and we also do lots of work researching public attitudes and working with members of the public to produce timely insights into emerging technologies, new policy and regulatory challenges, and difficult ethical questions at the intersection of technology and society. We are doing a lot of work at the moment on AI regulation, and so I was really pleased to have the opportunity to share some of that with you. And I will introduce some of the reports and pieces of research we've been doing before I give some more specific remarks on transparency, bias, and accountability. Before I do that, I was very pleased to listen to my co-panelists' remarks, and much of them I agreed with, some of them I disagreed with, or I take a different view, I suppose. And in particular, when Bojana was talking about the way in which we should approach AI as thinking about not placing overly burdensome requirements on companies and really thinking about what we might lose if we don't deploy AI. I suppose my challenge to that would be that we could think slightly differently, which is what do we want AI to do in our society? What are the good things it can bring? And then start from that perspective, rather than from feeling like it is an inevitability that we can only respond to. I think we need to remind ourselves that we have agency when it comes to new technologies, and we can choose how it impacts our society and the ways in which it's incorporated. And I think that links to the question for you as lawmakers, which is, what is regulation for? Why are we using regulation at all? It's not just about responding or trying to confine unstoppable forces. It's also about putting a positive vision out there. It can create infrastructure on which societies are built, and it can create the outline for socially beneficial innovation. I don't think it should be the case that the burden of proof is on you to establish that regulation is necessary at all, but rather the burden of proof is on those who want to deploy AI to establish that regulation is not necessary because there is good practice or there is responsible approaches in place. And I think this is a tension that runs through lots of different perspectives on AI regulations, but I just wanted to offer that framing, which is certainly how we think about it at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So I'll just direct you to some of our research reports, which might be of use to you after this panel. The first is called Regulate to Innovate, and it was a study based on a interdisciplinary panel of experts that we convened last year to explore different approaches to AI regulations. And this report is specifically addressed to the UK government, who at the time was putting together its AI strategy. And in fact, the UK will publish a white paper on AI regulation quite soon. But I think there are some interesting reflections and recommendations in there that could be of use to your own legislative approach. We ask, what are the goals of AI regulation? What are the challenges of regulating AI? What tools and approaches might be useful in regulating AI? And we lay out various options in terms of where should the locus of regulation be? For example, should we have horizontal comprehensive regulation? Should we have risk-based approaches? Should regulation speak to a particular domain? Or should it speak to uses that are cross-domain or other types of criteria? And we also ask, who should be regulated? How should they be regulated? And when in the AI lifecycle they should be regulated? So we really try to break down the task of developing regulation into its component pieces. So that might be of use, and I'll put links to these pieces in the chat after my contribution. The second piece of work that we've done is around the EU AI Act in particular, and you'll know that that is in draft form at the moment. We've published 2 reports. The first is an expert opinion, which identifies 4 problems with the existing draft of the Act. And those might be instructive for you as you consider your own regulatory opportunity. So the 4 problems we look at are the fact that the Act does not create rights of action or redress for individuals, but rather speaks only to developers and users of AI systems. That the AI Act approaches AI as a product rather than as a service or as a system, which is increasingly how it is being used and will be used in the future. That the risk-based framework has some limitations and does little to take account of genuine risk assessments or assessments of genuine risk, particularly to fundamental rights. And the final point being that there is a lack of a connection between the Act and the fundamental human rights which it aims to protect. We also published People, Risk and the Unique Requirements of AI, in which we set out 18 recommendations for strengthening the AI Act, again, which might be of interest to you all. Finally, it might be of interest to have a look at the work, that we have done on impact assessment. So we've done a number of things, but 2 that I should highlight. The first is looking at technical methods that regulators can use to audit and inspect algorithmic and AI systems. So this is really breaking down what types of capabilities would a regulator need in order to externally audit or verify or validate AI systems. And the other is we developed an AI or algorithmic impact assessment case study in the context of the health system. And that is a template for the types of impact assessments that might be used in other domains as well. So I'd like then to move to some more specific observations on how AI regulation can address the challenges of transparency, bias, and due process. And these are grounded in research we've done at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So transparency, to speak first to transparency, of course, transparency has a long history and tradition in anti-corruption work, and it's become a central fixture in algorithmic accountability debates. However, these often skip over the fundamental conversation about what transparency is trying to achieve and how we can make it meaningful rather than tokenistic. So transparency as a term has been used to cover a range of objectives and meanings, from the specific to the general. So in some instances, transparency means corporate reporting on the types of data sets they have. And at the more specific end, lots of people are talking about explanation in terms of the publication of specific codes and technical information underlying an AI system. There's lots of interesting research on what constitutes meaningful transparency, including by Mike Anani and Kate Crawford, who point out the important distinction between visibility and understanding. So just because information about AI is in the public domain, it doesn't mean that individuals understand that information or have the competence to interpret and leverage that information as an instrument of accountability. Nevertheless, as a baseline, transparency obligations in AI regulation should create visibility of otherwise opaque and easily obscured systems. This visibility can be achieved through a number of mechanisms. So we've written a report on transparency mechanisms, and we pointed out 5 which are available for creating greater visibility of AI systems in the public sector in particular. And those are impact assessments and other types of evaluations, procurement documents that can be put in the public interest, which shed light on public-private partnerships, open source and open data standards, freedom of information and subject access requests, and standardized disclosure of data and transparency registers. So the draft EU AI Act currently proposes 2 main mechanisms for transparency. One is a register of high-risk applications, and the other is obligations to keep relevant documentation about the data used in the development of the system, and about other aspects of the system. And these are complemented by existing Article 22 of the GDPR, which enables individuals to be informed when they've been subject to automated decision-making. These provisions are a good baseline, but I think they have limitations. For example, an obligation to keep relevant documentation about a system doesn't really benefit the public if that documentation is only accessed by a regulator or an auditor or a public body. So I think a more comprehensive requirement to conduct an impact assessment prior to the deployment of an AI system and to place that impact assessment in the public domain would increase the visibility of the system and then become a tool for accountability. I take Bojana's point about the need to build on existing requirements, for example, to do a DPIA or a data protection impact assessment. But I think data protection impact assessments aren't comprehensive enough to take account of the full range of impacts of AI systems and their dynamic nature. I would also recommend you consider a register of AI systems, much in the way the EU AI Act has, in order to create the visibility around the systems. Under the draft EU law, the register only includes high-risk systems, so the definition of high risk is critical in limiting or opening up how many of the systems are actually on the register. And for a register to work well, there will need to be quite a lot of work done in standardizing information that goes in the register. And in this regard, it's worth looking at the UK's new algorithmic transparency standard, which follows many other city-level transparency register initiatives in places like Helsinki, Helsinki, Amsterdam, and Nantes in France. And the UK is building on that, and they've set a transparency standard which requires public bodies to structure data around AI and algorithmic systems in certain ways, and to document how tools are used, why, what alternatives were considered, the data the system uses, how humans are involved and trained, and how the system sits within wider processes. So it's a pretty comprehensive bird's eye view that goes in the system, that goes into a register. So it's not only just the fact that an AI system is being deployed. To move on to, apologies, I'm not doing a great job of keeping up with my slides. To move on to bias, I think it's really important, and Anupam touched on this, that we, while the tendency of algorithmic systems to generate bias has been well documented, it is important to reiterate that bias is about more than just data. So it can be baked into the system at the design end, so through the opinions, experiences, and blind spots of those developing the system, and through design choices or technical design. It's baked into the data set because of historical social biases and cultural biases, in which certain groups or demographics may be either overrepresented in data sets. For example, in police data sets, in which people of color may be overrepresented because of discriminatory policing, or underrepresented in data sets. So for example, in the example of the Amazon recruitment algorithm, which preferred or deprioritized female applicants because of the historic absence of female workers within Amazon's workforce. And then finally, there can be bias in the deployment of the system. So for example, if facial recognition technology is being deployed in already over-policed areas or in social housing. It's really important to understand that these three facets of bias exist so that there's not a technical fix for bias, and it's not simply a matter of debiasing data sets, if such a thing is even technically possible. Although debiasing data sets is a necessary, but if insufficient, part of addressing bias in automated systems. The draft EU law doesn't really speak about bias comprehensively, although it does require data to be complete and free of errors, and requires developers to examine data sets with a view to identifying possible bias. It doesn't place any obligations to identify biased outcomes, and this is where I believe the Brazilian law could go further. Looking at biased outcomes and impacts of a system would require extending the role of human oversight. So under the EU law, human oversight only comes in terms of validating certain decisions, but a more progressive law might actually expand human oversight to include a role for mandatory ex post assessments of the outcomes and impacts of AI systems to ensure that bias is not part of the outcome. Finally, and very briefly, even with the safeguards previously discussed in place, unless there is a right to an effective remedy for people affected by AI systems, then they will not enjoy full protection from discrimination and other human rights infringements, and thus enable their enjoyment of right to due process. So our most significant critique of the EU AI Act is that it doesn't talk about people affected by systems at all, and it certainly doesn't create any rights for them, unlike, for example, the GDPR. So we believe it's paramount that any AI regulation give affected persons a voice under the legal framework, a right to information, to seek review, to bring a complaint, and to go to court if necessary. And I think that that would be a key element of any law the Brazilian Senate would ultimately adopt. I'll leave it there, but happy to answer further questions. And thank you again for the opportunity to meet with you.
Muito obrigada. Rapidamente, né, o que foi falado.
Thank you so much. Just saying briefly about what was brought to us with us. It's essential, the document. It's key to understand, to know the ones from the Institute, especially the critics to European legislation and the impact of the algorithm. We also talked about transparency, and it became a token. So we deal with that in a very superficial way. So how can we have a debate to not deal with transparency in a superficial way? So we talked about all these ideas and the importance of evaluating the input and output of all the data, the development of such technology, the set of data, and all the AI system and the need of oversight, human supervision, and new rights for the people affected by AI. And now I'm going to introduce our next guest, which is Mark Rothenberg, President and founder of the Center of AI and Digital Policy, which is an especially expert. They advocate and work to promote justice and fairness in the AI world. Mark has served as an expert advisor in AI policy to many international organizations, including Council of Europe, the OECD, UNESCO. Mark also helped draft the Universal Guideline for Artificial Intelligence and is the author of the forthcoming law of artificial intelligence. You're welcome. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for this kind invitation to be with you today. I'm honored to be speaking with the Commission, the members of the Brazilian Senate, regarding artificial intelligence policy. I also want to commend you for the important work that you are doing. Over the last several years, I've worked with many international organizations and national governments, and I believe there's a growing sense of urgency to establish the appropriate legal framework to govern artificial intelligence, because as the other speakers have made clear, we're living in a moment of a transformative technology that will have great amplifying effects. Problems can be exacerbated by the deployment of AI, and we need to understand this dynamic, and we need to put in place the appropriate regulation to maximize the benefits and to minimize the risk. Now, I will cover a lot of information, but I'll move quickly through these slides and make the slides available to you. To answer the question how we are to govern artificial intelligence, I will describe for you first the report that we have published. It is the first comprehensive review of AI policies and practices in 50 countries, focusing on the goal of preserving democratic values. I will briefly highlight significant legal frameworks, which Brazil, in fact, has already endorsed. I will make a few specific recommendations for your national legislation, and finally highlight policy challenges ahead. I'll begin by saying that several years ago, I had compiled a source book on AI policy, and I then began to look at national AI strategies and the many codes of conduct for artificial intelligence. And I was immediately struck by how many framework principles were announced. At one point, there were over 300 AI policy initiatives worldwide, and it seemed to me vitally important to begin the process of assessment, to look closely at what governments were actually doing, both in their announced policies and also in their practices. So in this article, I announced a plan and a methodology to assess national AI policies. And the outcome has been the publication of this report, which you can find online at our website. You can scan the QR code, much like I imagine you can scan a menu if you'd like, and download the report. It is extensive and contains a lot of detail about the current state of AI policies and practices. Our goal was to document these policies, to create a methodology, to provide also a basis for comparative evaluation, so we could talk about how one country's AI policies practices compared with another, and we could also over time assess the direction of national policy to see whether there was improvement or perhaps a bit of backsliding. As I said, our goal is to support the development of policies that preserve democratic values, generally described in terms of trustworthy and human-centric AI, but there are other ways to do this as well. We worked with a large research team, and every time I talk about the report, I'd like to commend the participants in the study who made possible this report. We created 12 metrics. So we asked such questions as whether a country had endorsed the OECD AI principles and whether they have implemented the OECD AI principles. We also looked to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a foundational document to assess compliance with global human rights norms. And we rated and ranked countries. We looked at AI policy developments at many international organizations. The G7 and the G20 both are contributing to the development of international AI policy norms, and they are worth following. This particular report follows from earlier comparative studies that we had done when we were looking at the impact of new technology on fundamental rights. They reflect a desire to provide a country report narrative, like human rights reports oftentimes do. We believe the reporting is objective and evidence-based, so that we can have a common reference framework to discuss the current state of affairs. We're committed to an annual publication. And as I said, this leads to ratings and rankings. Let me say a few words about the metrics that we established, because I think these metrics also point to the elements of a national AI law that you may wish to consider. As I said before, the OECD AI principles are a significant framing document. Brazil, in fact, was one of the original signatories, original countries to endorse the OECD AI principles, but you also need to ask, have the principles been endorsed? We go through similar steps with the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. We ask questions about transparency, and transparency is not only about the transparency of the decision-making or the algorithm, it's also about the transparency of public participation in the development of the national AI strategy. It includes, for example, the availability of AI-related materials. We believe that it's important for countries to put in place independent agencies to conduct AI oversight. Sometimes this can be done with a data protection agency or perhaps a national human rights institute, but there needs to be some counterbalance, if you will, to the deployment of AI systems in both the private sector and also by the government. We look for certain key terms in national AI strategies, including fairness, accountability, and transparency. We do believe there needs to be a legal right to algorithmic transparency. I think you will find this already in Article 22 of the GDPR. You will also find it in the Council of Europe Convention 108 plus, Article 9, which talks about access to the factors that contribute to a decision. We ask questions about whether countries have supported the Universal Guidelines for AI, which I'll come back to, as well as the UNESCO recommendation and certain resolutions that have been before the Global Privacy Assembly. That's a network of data protection officials around the world that over the last few years has also looked more closely. These metrics allow us to rate countries and to rank countries. We have 5 tiers here with Canada, Germany, Italy, and Korea at the top based on our methodology. Brazil is currently in the middle tier, although I will note simply by virtue of organizing this very important conference and commission, we would already adjust scores to acknowledge the enhanced level of public engagement in the development of the national AI strategy. The recommendations that followed from our review of country practices was, in the first instance, to support democratic values, to create robust mechanisms for independent oversight. We've mentioned fairness, accountability, and transparency. Countries, of course, should commit to these principles in the deployment of their own systems for public administration. We also recommended, as many others have, to halt the use of facial recognition for mass surveillance. That remains one of the most contested issues in the world of AI policy. This past year, we updated our recommendations. I was very pleased to hear Professor Stuart Russell on your first panel, very influential figure across the field of AI policy, but I think he, more than anyone else, has made clear the need for countries to curtail the deployment of lethal autonomous weapon systems. We also recommend that countries begin implementation of the UNESCO recommendation, and anticipating a convention from the Council of Europe, we endorse a legally binding instrument. There are a few more words here. You will find this also on our website, a summary of significant AI policy developments over the past year. I think this may be useful for you to contextualize the work that is currently underway that you are undertaking in Brazil in terms of the larger global scope of AI policy developments. Let me say a few words about the key policy frameworks. There are at this moment 5. There is, as I mentioned earlier, the OECD AI principles, the first global framework for AI. It is influential. It was launched significantly by the former world chess champion and human rights advocate, Garry Kasparov. Kasparov had his own run-in with AI back in 1997 when he lost to Deep Blue, the IBM AI machine that defeated a world chess champion. So I guess he was fully supportive of this new regulatory initiative. But it was groundbreaking, and it did establish a basis to begin to talk about global norms for AI policy. You may well know OECD principles are non-binding, but they can be very influential, and other OECD principles in the realm of privacy, computer security, and risk assessment, for example, have led to national law and international agreement. Brazil endorsed the OECD AI principles at the outset, and also by virtue of being a G20 nation, effectively supported the OECD principles when the G20 incorporated those principles the same year, 2019, in the form of their AI guidelines. The OECD continues to do very good work on implementation, which we fully support. And they have a wonderful website, oecd.ai, to provide further information about the developments at national levels. But simultaneously with the work at the OECD, there was also an important initiative launched by civil society organizations with the support of scientific groups and AI policy experts called the Universal Guidelines for AI. This framework was published at the Privacy Commissioners Conference in Brussels in 2018, and it set out 12 principles for the regulation of AI. It speaks more directly to some of the controversial AI practices than did the OECD AI principles, specifically calling for prohibitions on secret profiling and unitary scoring, what some might also call social scoring, as well as making clear the rights and responsibilities in the deployment of AI systems. Finally, this past year, UNESCO adopted a recommendation on AI ethics that we think will be enormously influential, and Brazil was also one of the countries to support this effort. I'm summarizing based on UNESCO's own press statements. They believe that this is an important contribution to protect data, to ban social scoring and mass surveillance, as we had earlier recommended. They also put in place techniques for monitoring and evaluation, including an ethical impact assessment requirement. And they spoke specifically to the need, as we think about AI policy, to protect the environment. Because of course, many AI systems, particularly in the realm of natural language processing, for example, where you can have billions of parameters in a data model, are enormously energy intensive. Looking ahead, you've heard from others about the EU AI Act. I won't repeat the comments of others other than to say there's still a lot of discussion ahead. There were more than 3,000 amendments that were introduced last week at the deadline. There'll be a negotiation between the institutions of the European Union. We are anticipating what some sometimes describe as the Brussels effect associated with the GDPR. The EU does have the ability through regulation to have broad global influence, but I'd also like to call your attention to an initiative underway at the Council of Europe, where there is a proposal to establish a convention on AI, similar to the Cybercrime Convention or the Privacy Convention. We anticipate this will also be very influential. And as you may know, the Council of Europe is committed to democratic institutions, fundamental rights, and the rule of law. Now, a few brief recommendations for the national law in Brazil. I think a good starting point is certainly to build on pre-existing commitments. And in that regard, the OECD AI principles and the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics both provide a good basis to articulate a national legal framework for the regulation of artificial intelligence. We would propose also the metrics set out in the AI and democratic values report to ensure that there's independent oversight and the right of algorithmic transparency. Universal guidelines will provide some guidance with regard to those applications that may in fact need to be prohibited, which is not an easy thing for lawmakers to do. But if you spend some time in the field of AI policy, you will see that the red line challenge is probably one of the greatest challenges that policymakers face today. The European Law Institute has also put out several excellent recommendations we would point you to. So impact assessments, independent oversight, and particularly with a focus on fundamental rights and public safety. I'm going to close here by also just being a little bit provocative, which is to say, while we can, in a fairly straightforward manner, track the evolution of AI policy and see how it is being adopted into national law, we can also see the challenges that are emerging. And I'll just briefly outline what seem to me at this moment to be 5 key challenges. One is the big data imperative. And while I have regard for my co-panelists, I simply don't accept the premise that AI requires big data. There are many AI systems, rule-based expert systems, for example, that were not built on large data sets, but they're also very thoughtful computer scientists, including Stuart Russell and Judea Pearl, who have pushed back against this presumption that we necessarily need to accumulate a lot of data, and we necessarily, therefore, have to weaken privacy rules for sensitive data or for data minimization. I think that's simply not correct. My second point regarding the red line is that this is an enormous challenge, and it will not be an easy challenge to confront. But to protect human safety, I think it will be vital to be able to prohibit the deployment of certain AI systems. This neoliberal mythology that the problems of inequity, I believe there's little support for that, little evidence for that, and that's also reality. Machine learning itself poses challenges because the results that are produced are not provable. They can't be systems of validation and credentialing, but at the heart of the scientific method is a commitment to being able to reproduce results to establish their veracity. Machine learning turns the page on that. And finally, very interesting question about the durability of democratic institutions, the relationship between AI and democracy. I'll leave you with this thought on the panel topic today, transparency, bias, and due process, and the particular problem of machine learning. Karl Popper said that as we think about scientific discovery, we actually need statements. And if it is not possible to falsify a statement, then the statement, in fact, does not speak about reality. This is a very important insight as to how machine learning operates when we get results that we are told to accept, but we will not be able to disprove. So I'll close here. Thank you again so much for your time. I'm happy, of course, to share the slides with the committee and to answer any questions you may have.
Obrigada. Agradeço muito, Mark Rothenberg, pela
Thank you so much, Mark Rothenberg, for your speech, for your description of the report of AI in 50 countries, for all the international recommendations and initiatives, and to talk about all of them, and besides your recommendation, and to end with this provocation. So I believe this was a very important presentation, but also connected to the previous one when it talked about the instruments of recommendations and also instruments of impact, as well as key points about data and machine learning. So now I will pass on the floor to the last speaker of the day, Nanjira Sambu. Nanjira is a researcher, policy analyst, and strategist interested in and working understanding the unfolding gender impacts of ICT adoption on governance, diplomacy, media, entrepreneurship, and culture. Nanjira is a fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and for Global Fellows. She's also a co-chair of Transform Health and board member of the new Humanitarian Development Gateway and Digital Impact. She also advises Carnegie Council's AI Equality Initiative and also Gender Advisory Board in the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development. She's also a diplomacy moderator at the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Participator. I pass on the floor to Nanjira. Thanks so much for your contribution.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and greetings all, as we say in Kenya, Jambo. I am dialing in from Brussels, as the Brussels effect was mentioned, and I was here having interesting intellectual debates about cyber norms and how, all these regulatory mechanisms for the digital age should be set up. But instead of diving deeper into that, I want to share my inputs based on context. I think over and above all the theoretical debates or legal mechanisms, really bringing context and society to this is very important. And I will share my inputs based on something similar that is happening in Kenya. And just to show that we also need to bring the perspective that is from emerging and developing countries into how we all think about regulating or legislating digital technology. And I'll start by a quote I think is really important to this conversation that says that automated decision-making systems are not purely technological. They comprise a number of elements, including the data that enables predictive decision-making machines, the institutions that provide regulatory settings, and the people who design, use, imagine, and adapt automated systems, and more importantly, whose lives are affected by them. And so you can have, automated decision-making being introduced by the public sector or the private sector, especially where development is a factor and something that I've seen mentioned in the regulations that Brazil is considering. And I'll share my inputs based on what we've seen as an introduction of automated decision-making in Kenya, where the public sector and the current administration is very interested in ensuring that they deliver on their promise, though they are 4 months or actually 2 months away from being from an election, on an affordable housing program or affordable homes program that is aiming to give effect to the right to accessible and adequate housing that is a constitutional right. One of the main ways they're aiming to achieve this is through introducing a credit and risk decision-making system that's supposedly fully automated. Now, it's designed, the system that is being implemented is designed to collect device metadata, social networks and email data, telecommunications and utility services providers data, and data from credit bureaus to autonomously develop credit profiles. So that if we are all applicants, we will pass the credit check stage of the process if we meet some of the criteria that a technical committee puts together. If not, applicants are screened out. Right there are so many troubles and risks, and I think that would resonate, and many might probably come to mind for many of you. And even starting with the legal setting we have in our country, it does already come up against the data protection laws we have. And they have their own limitations, as I'll speak to shortly. But the first thing is that the right of the data subjects in this configuration comes up for debate, because there are legal effects on the data subjects, and especially those who are rejected through this profiling process, which brings up due process considerations that the lawyers here would speak better to. But in our Data Protection Act that came to effect just about the same time as Brazil's own data protection legislation, does speak to the right to not be subject to automated decision-making in Section 35 of our Data Protection Act. However, it does not distinguish between automated decision-making and profiling. So there aren't really effective provisions for both in the Kenyan Data Protection Act. And while a right to effective remedy is not explicitly, and also a right to effective remedy is not acknowledged, it's just a right that an individual has to submit a complaint. So we don't know how that process would actually go through if I feel like I need to seek recourse if I was not accepted for affordable housing. Now, if you take the system's data input as an angle, everything from social network data to device data to utility services data and data from credit bureaus. Each of those aspects can be challenged based on the social context. They sound objectively, valid, but when you bring the social context, it becomes more complicated. For example, how many people who would be applying for affordable housing programs would be on social networks? It's a function of affordability of the internet. It is a function of affordability and availability of devices. Similarly, device metadata could complicate the application of one user if they also share devices with other people in their social setting. The most contentious and the most surprising to find in this is that a lot of it is weighted on data from credit bureaus, because Kenya, as you know, is a leading player in digital financial inclusion through the M-Pesa system. However, because of the sort of financial innovation or fintech innovation ecosystem it has spawned off, we have the credit bureau mechanism, in a sense, being misused by digital lenders. So if I default on a small amount of a loan, or if I default by a day, there have been situations where people are already listed on that credit bureau, and the process of having that reversed is too burdensome on an individual. So if that same individual in a vulnerable population group or low income group has been listed because they sought out a loan and they maybe was no data to send back the money through mobile money, they are listed, and the process of then getting removed is quite tenuous. It is quite surprising to then see the same government that has noticed this as a problem base this program on such, or rather a similar process. And here another aspect comes in that will be very important and I think would resonate for the Brazilian Senate to think about. You may see these issues raised by the private sector or external actors when they want to bring services to your country, but also you have to think about what it means when your own government wants to use the same mechanism. How do you balance that, and how do you actually effectively legislate for that? It even becomes more complicated if we start adopting systems like we see in other countries and other jurisdictions where automated decision-making is being used in the judiciary process. So all the systems that should check, create checks and balances in public administration, if they take on their own variety of automated decision-making, we find ourselves in a very interesting situation, a very complicated situation for that matter. Now, the Kenyan government presently is marketing this automation process as development. And rather than acknowledging the risks, the policy document that is marketing this speaks of a need to continuously upgrade the automation system to enhance efficacy. Now, the allocation criteria that they broadly list out in the same policy document does read at first glance as representative, or considering the many sort of like issues we put in place like diversity and consideration for low cost, people with disabilities and so on and so forth. But how these decisions are then encoded and how they then churn out the decisions and how those decisions that are automated are put in check is what is not transparent. We also don't know how the technical committee that's supposed to be the human decision-making factor is constituted at this point. And therefore, we all know that there would be some biases there that could effectively be baked in. And there's also an assumption that some of the other requirements that an applicant would have are easy or universally accessible. For example, a national identity card, registration or being registered with a tax man and having an identification number. And these particularly weight in a very disproportionate way against people in marginalized communities or far off areas where government services are not readily available, who are most likely to be trying to apply for affordable housing. Then there's some interesting decisions that are not fed into the input, but based on our political economy, are very important to think about. So they say that there are some other considerations that have some interesting scoring that we don't know how they arrived. One example is generally in those listings, if you tend to be a person without children, whether you're single, widowed, or otherwise, you get a lower score than those with children. So is that in itself a subjective discrimination or a subjective weighting that has not been subject to public consultation? Then there's also the concept of an ethnic mix and gender balance that will be considered after decisions are made by this automated system. So all of it just really is a very unclear way of trying to mix automated decision-making and human decision-making, but currently seems to say that first comes the automation, then comes the human decision-making to balance that. So like I said, very little information is actually publicly available. I really did have to dig in to be able to bring this perspective. And if this precedent is set by how the Kenyan public administration takes this on based on political pressures to deliver on a promise the government made on affordable housing, then you then have technologies being co-opted into politicized agendas by different administrations. So it is also very concerning that this idea of the financial aspect, if you're not creditworthy or if you are creditworthy, is a determinant of this, as I mentioned, because the government itself has been witnessing firsthand how we are reaching the place where we're asking ourselves whether having people digitally financially included is necessarily leading to financially healthy populations. If the moment you default on a loan or the moment you miss a payment by a day, you're listed in the credit bureau, but also because of lack of informed user consent, people's contact lists are then are notified that, you all have not paid, I have not paid the loan that I took from a creditor, typically a digital lender. And many of these companies are also external actors who've come to operate in the Kenyan market. So it's very surprising again to see that that's the way this has been taken. So, in this configuration, sometimes you can end up in a situation where these automated tools could be worse because they are very opaque, again, to the experts, let alone ordinary citizens. So it makes these decisions difficult to analyze, to challenge, and where politics are involved, that is even doubly complicated. So this faith we sometimes tend to put in the power of technology does shield algorithmic systems from critical interrogation in general. And we end up in this technologically driven decision-making process that does defy interrogation, analysis, and accountability, therefore undermining due process. So in a sense, we have a question here. Does algorithmic decision-making become a legitimate source of any kind of authority? I think this is a really important question, even as you read through what has been baked in as principles or lines in the regulations as they stand right now. So for me, I think it's the technicalities of how it works is one aspect to look into, but these intrinsic motivations by different actors to introduce automated decision-making in very diverse contexts and very diverse countries is very important to think about. Countries, I think, like Brazil and Kenya have a doubly challenging task because when it comes to transparency, to mitigating bias, and to ensuring through the due process through automated decision-making, you must look at your own administration's considerations on introducing them. You must look at the technologies that may be developed by local, private sector, but also the technologies coming from outside that are coming into our countries. So when we talk about these regulations, are we saying they're uniformly going to be applied to all, or are we going to excuse our governments when they want to use it, but they also want to keep, external companies in check by certain laws? Then there's an issue of privacy, which always comes up as a measure to prevent, to preserve through, in the digital age. A lot of what we must also bear in mind is that the mechanisms that some have been mentioned, like the OECD guidelines and other guidelines, like the General Data Protection Regulation here in the EU, do focus a bit too much on the individual and forget the relational nature of privacy. So for many cultures outside of the West, how individuals understand privacy is sometimes very different from the kinds of legislation we end up having. So very basically putting, and is to say it's all the same everywhere, for a lot of people, privacy is when you have something to hide. And so that becomes such a weird dynamic when you say, I'm online and I have nothing to hide, so maybe I accept all the cookies and, so on and so forth. We do not have laws on our side of the world that are accommodating the relational and contextual nature of privacy, so that our value of our data, it may not be big data, is diverse data. If somebody today wants to diversify their data sets, say in a European context, and they get some Brazil data, it doesn't have to be the entire representative data set, and they get some Kenyan data and brings that. That's unique qualitative data is what we need to be thinking about protecting. And we do not yet have mechanisms to think about that. And this is where we also need to look into our own philosophies in non-Western countries, because they offer us opportunities to think about beyond the technical guardrails, the philosophical, the ethical, and societal guardrails. And there's some interesting work that already is looking at how we can take concepts like Ubuntu, which is an African philosophy of I am because we are. So that takes on that relational nature of existence. And also some that are looking at Buddhism as a philosophy to help think about how we talk about ethics, how we talk about the laws and the regulations and the guardrails we put in mind. That should be helpful for thinking about the way we set up regulations. And I think Brazil could be a very interesting leader for the South in this, in saying that we've also not just consulted from the OECD or from the US markets, but we've also looked at cultures of the South and the idea of South-South cooperation to understand where other tensions that have not been resolved we can get alternative knowledge. So we also have to look, make sure that in introducing regulations, whether it's AI regulations or other regulations, when it comes to enforcing them, you do not end up in a situation where undue burden has been placed on the local actors to comply, when those who maybe have the power, could be external actors, external companies, are not registered or are not operational in your country. And so the undue burden is borne by those who are trying to, who are local actors and not those who are abroad. That's a very interesting dynamic we've seen, especially in data protection domain. So I'll just close again with another quote by Ari Waldman that I think is really important to think about here. Algorithmic decision-making systems are social and political and economic expressions of neoliberal managerialization, or an organizational system of public or private governance that prioritizes freedom and efficiency above all other values. Is that what we want to see in our parts of the world? I look forward to hopefully seeing that reflected in the eventual regulations. Thank you so much.
Queria agradecer muito a fala da Nanjira e fazer aqui, levantar alguns...
I would like to thank very much Nanjira's speech. Was very important, Nanjira, to bring this global South perspective. First of all, we are talking about technology system, but not only, but persons as well. The ones that have the relationships affected by these systems and need to understand the social context in this debate about decision-making that are automatized, because sometimes the global debate do not bring to light issues like poverty, social inequality, digital inequality, and access to digital systems that have a great impact both in data input and assessment and others. And as much as this impacts people's lives as well, like we said, injustice, equity, as well as the legitimacy of these systems as related to governmental systems, as related to public policies, and the need for checks and balances, in which we have all the other technical issues and algorithms that are considered to the structural poverty, inequality, and access to digital and automatized systems. So there are a lot of other things from the Kenya experience, but we don't have time to mention them all. I would like to highlight that you brought to us the need to highlight other values, not only science, but also other issues related to artificial intelligence. I will pass on the floor to the president of the table. I would like to say in the name of the lawmakers from the Senate, thank all the speakers for their valuable contributions. I would like to thank also all our debaters, Mariana Valente and Stella Aranha. And before we finish the panel, I would like to say that tomorrow this seminary will continue with 4 more panels that are very important. That is going to deal with personal data, regulatory techniques based on risk, sectorial perspectives, and the last panel, the accountability system. They are all key topics for the debates that are being done here. So at last, I would like to declare this 7th meeting for the lawmaking jurists finished, and I would like to invite everybody to the debate that will happen tomorrow on the panels. Thank you so much.